Before we begin, let me speak to you not as someone standing above you, but as someone standing with you. I don't want to teach at you. I don't want to sound distant, polished, or untouchable. I want to talk to you the way I would if we were sitting across from each other in a quiet moment, where masks aren't needed and defenses can finally rest. If you're here, it's probably because you felt something that's hard to explain. A tension inside, a pull in opposite directions, a strange exhaustion that doesn't come from work or lack of sleep, but from inner conflict. Part of you wants growth, depth, truth, peace, alignment, and another part of you resists it with surprising strength. You try to pray, but your mind wanders. You try to change, but old habits pull you back. You feel called to something higher, but your body, emotions, and impulses seem to sabotage the very thing your soul longs for. And at some point, you may have asked yourself quietly, why does this feel like a fight? Why is becoming who I'm meant to be so uncomfortable? If spiritual awakening is good, why does part of me hate it? This is not because you are weak. This is not because you are failing. And this is not because something is wrong with you. It's because there is a war happening inside you. And most people were never taught how to recognize it. Your flesh does not resist your awakening because it is evil. It resists because awakening threatens its control. And until you understand that, you'll keep blaming yourself for a battle that was never meant to be gentle. So take a breath, stay with me, and let's talk about what's really happening inside you. The flesh is not your body. It is a survival identity. Most people misunderstand the word flesh. They think it simply means the physical body, muscles, skin, appetite, desire. But the flesh is not just biology. It is not merely hunger, sexuality, or comfort-seeking. The flesh is something far deeper and far more strategic. The flesh is an identity built for survival. It is the version of you that learned how to stay safe in a broken world. It formed when you were hurt, disappointed, abandoned, overwhelmed, or unseen. It adapted to pain. It learned patterns. It memorized what worked and what didn't. And over time it became loud, protective, reactive, and controlling. The flesh is not concerned with truth. It is concerned with predictability. It doesn't ask, what is right? It asks, what keeps me alive? What keeps me comfortable? What keeps me from feeling pain again? This is why your flesh panics when you move towards spiritual awakening. Awakening demands surrender. The flesh survives through control. Awakening calls you into the unknown. The flesh only trusts what it can predict. Awakening invites you to die to old versions of yourself. The flesh is those old versions. So when you begin to awaken, when you start questioning old beliefs, releasing old attachments, loosening old identities, the flesh interprets this as a threat, not a metaphorical threat, a real one. To the flesh, change feels like death, and this is where the conflict begins, because your spirit is drawn to truth, depth, meaning, and alignment, even if it costs you comfort. But your flesh was trained in an environment where comfort meant safety. It learned that if it could control outcomes, manage perceptions, avoid vulnerability, and cling to familiar patterns, it could protect you from pain. So when spiritual awakening shows up and says, let go, trust, die to this. Step into uncertainty. Release the identity that kept you safe but small. The flesh does not hear wisdom. It hears danger, and it reacts accordingly. Your flesh does not fight you openly at first. It is subtle. It disguises resistance as logic. It calls fear common sense. It labels avoidance as discernment. It wraps attachment in spirituality and calls it wisdom. It says things like, you can grow later. You're not ready yet. This is too extreme. Why change what still works? You're overthinking this. Everyone else lives this way, and because the flesh knows your voice, your history, and your insecurities, it speaks in your tone. That's what makes it dangerous. You don't hear an enemy, you hear yourself. This is why spiritual awakening often feels confusing before it feels freeing. You feel pulled forward by something quiet, deep, and persistent, and pulled backward by something loud, emotional, and convincing. The flesh does not shout, "I want control." It says, "I just want peace." But its definition of peace is not alignment. It is absence of disruption. True peace comes from wholeness. The flesh wants numbness. True peace allows truth to surface. The flesh avoids truth if it threatens stability. And spiritual awakening is nothing if not disruptive. Here is something few people tell you. The flesh is not afraid of God. It is afraid of transformation. It is comfortable with religion, rituals, routines, and rules, as long as they do not require inner death. You can pray daily and still live in the flesh. You can quote scripture and still be ruled by fear. You can appear spiritual while remaining internally unchanged. The flesh loves external spirituality because it gives the illusion of growth without demanding surrender. But awakening is internal. It asks you to confront motives, wounds, attachments, and identities you've hidden behind for years. It asks you to stop using coping mechanisms that once protected you, but now imprison you. And the flesh knows this. So it resists, not because it hates light, but because light exposes. It exposes the bargains you made with comfort, the stories you tell yourself to avoid change, the ways you've confused survival with life, and exposure feels unbearable to something built on concealment. This is why spiritual growth often intensifies inner conflict instead of immediately bringing peace. You are not becoming worse, you are becoming aware, and awareness threatens systems built on autopilot. Your flesh wants you unconscious, not asleep but unexamined. As long as you move through life reacting instead of choosing, it remains in control. Awakening interrupts that. Suddenly you notice why you react the way you do. You see patterns you used to excuse. You feel discomfort where numbness once lived. And the flesh interprets this awareness as instability, so it pushes back harder. It increases temptation when you commit to discipline. It amplifies doubt when you choose faith. It intensifies old habits when you try to release them. Not because you're regressing, but because the flesh is losing territory. Every time you choose presence over impulse, awareness over reaction, surrender over control, something in you dies, and that something is not your essence. It is your armor, and armor does not come off without resistance. The hardest part of this war is not the battle itself, it's the misunderstanding. People think that if awakening were real, it would feel peaceful from the beginning. But birth is not peaceful. Growth stretches. Transformation disorients. And the flesh hates disorientation. It wants you to remain the person who learned how to survive your past, even if that person cannot enter your future. So it clings. It reminds you of who you used to be. It tempts you with familiar escapes. It whispers, "This version of you kept you alive." And it's not wrong. But survival is not the same as fulfillment, and awakening is not about becoming safer, it's about becoming truer. This is why the war feels personal, because it is. It is not good versus evil in the abstract. It is old identity versus emerging truth. It is control versus trust. It is fear versus surrender. And you are standing in the middle of it. If this feels exhausting, it's because it is. But exhaustion does not mean defeat. It often means transition. And the fact that you feel this conflict at all is not evidence that you are failing spiritually. It is evidence that something in you is waking up, and something else is terrified of losing control. In the next part, we will go deeper into how this internal war plays out in daily life, in habits, emotions, relationships, and self-sabotage, and why awareness alone begins to weaken the flesh's grip. For now, understand this. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are not imagining this fight. You are in the middle of a transformation, and the resistance you feel is the sound of an old identity realizing its time is ending. And when an old identity realizes its time is ending, it does not leave quietly. It tightens its grip. This is why right when you decide to change, the pull backward feels stronger than ever. Old desires resurface with intensity. Comfort becomes tempting in ways it never was before. Distractions multiply. Doubt suddenly sounds intelligent. Laziness feels justified, and fear disguises itself as wisdom. This is not coincidence. The flesh senses loss, and loss to the flesh feels like annihilation. What makes this internal war so painful is that the flesh is not an external enemy you can simply reject. It is not a stranger. It is familiar, intimate. It has your memories, your emotional reflexes, your learned behaviors. It knows which buttons to press because it helped install them. That's why awakening does not feel like becoming someone new at first. It feels like betraying someone old. You feel guilt for changing. You feel disloyal to the version of you that endured hardship. You feel fear that without your old defenses you will not survive. And this fear is real, but it is outdated. The flesh was formed in a chapter of your life where survival was the priority. Awakening begins when survival is no longer enough. And yet, the flesh does not know the difference between no longer needed and about to die, so it reacts the only way it knows how. It resists. One of the clearest signs that the flesh is active is urgency. The flesh rushes. The spirit invites patience. The flesh demands immediate relief. The spirit allows discomfort to teach. The flesh cannot sit in silence without reaching for something. The spirit speaks most clearly in stillness. This is why silence feels threatening when you begin to awaken. When the noise fades, the flesh loses its camouflage. There is no distraction to hide behind, no stimulation to numb awareness. No movement to avoid reflection, and suddenly you feel things you've been outrunning: regret, grief, longing, conviction, truth, not condemnation. Truth. And truth always threatens the flesh because truth requires change. Notice how the flesh negotiates. It rarely says, "Do not awaken." It says, "Just not now." It offers compromises that sound reasonable. Just one more time. Just one more season. Just until things settle. Just until you feel stronger. But later is one of the flesh's favorite hiding places. Because later never arrives. The flesh does not need to defeat awakening outright. It only needs to delay it long enough for momentum to fade. And momentum is fragile in the early stages of awakening. You are sensitive, open, uncertain, still learning how to listen. That's when the flesh is loudest. Another way the flesh resists awakening is through shame. When you fall back into old patterns, the flesh does not comfort you. It condemns you. It says, "See, you haven't changed. This proves you're not serious. You always come back here. Why even try?" But shame is not correction. It is paralysis, and paralysis keeps you exactly where the flesh wants you, stuck between desire and despair. The spirit convicts gently and invites return. The flesh accuses harshly and demands withdrawal. This is how you can tell the difference. If a voice pushes you away from growth, away from hope, away from truth, it is not guiding you. It is guarding its territory. What makes this war exhausting is that it is internal. No one sees it. People may look at you and see consistency, routine, even success, while inside you feel divided. One part of you knows there is more. Another part is terrified of losing what you have, and so you live in tension. You are awake enough to feel the conflict, but not yet free enough to rest. This is a painful place. But it is also a sacred one, because division is the beginning of discernment. Before awakening, everything inside you felt like me. Now, you are starting to see that not everything that speaks inside you is you. Some things are learned, some are inherited, some are protective patterns that overstayed their welcome. Awakening begins when you stop identifying with every impulse and start observing them. And observation weakens control. The flesh thrives on identification. As long as you say, "This is who I am," it remains unquestioned. But the moment you say, "This is something happening within me," space appears. And in that space, choice is born. That is why the flesh fears awareness more than discipline. You can force yourself into habits and still be ruled internally. But awareness dissolves unconscious authority. The flesh can survive rules, it cannot survive light. There will be moments in this process where you miss your old self. Not because that self was better, but because it was familiar. The unknown always feels unsafe to the flesh, even when it leads to freedom. So you may grieve, you may feel nostalgia for patterns that once soothed you, even if they harmed you. This grief is not regression, it is release. You are not longing for who you were, you are honoring who you needed to be. And honoring does not mean returning. If you are feeling resistance, tension, confusion, or inner pushback right now, let me say this clearly. This does not mean you are losing the war. It means the war has become conscious, and consciousness is the turning point. You are no longer being dragged blindly by impulse. You are no longer asleep inside old identities. You are no longer mistaking survival for life. The flesh resists because it knows something deeper is taking shape. And in the next part, we will explore how this war shows up in daily habits, emotional triggers, relationships, and self-sabotage, and why the very struggles you hate may be evidence that awakening is already underway. Stay here. This fight is not a sign that you are broken. It is a sign that you are waking up. Because waking up is rarely dramatic on the outside, but it is violent on the inside. And I don't mean violent in a destructive sense. I mean disruptive, shaking, unsettling, the kind of inner movement that rearranges things you thought were fixed. The flesh hates rearrangement. It prefers routines, even painful ones, over uncertainty. That's why awakening doesn't just challenge habits, it challenges the emotional contracts you made with yourself long ago. Contracts like, "I won't feel this again," "I'll stay in control," "I'll never be vulnerable like that," "I'll keep myself safe at all costs." These agreements were never written with words, but they were written with fear. And fear has a long memory. As awakening deepens, you may notice that situations that once felt normal now feel heavy. Conversations feel empty. Distractions lose their flavor. Things that used to excite you now leave you hollow. This isn't because life is becoming dull. It's because your sensitivity is increasing. The flesh interprets this sensitivity as weakness, but in reality, it is discernment being born. You are no longer able to numb yourself as easily, and numbness was one of the flesh's greatest tools. When numbness fades, awareness rushes in. And awareness demands honesty. Honesty is terrifying to the flesh because honesty exposes the gap between who you are living as and who you are called to become. That gap creates tension, and tension feels unbearable to something that survives by maintaining equilibrium. So the flesh looks for ways to close the gap without changing. It distracts, it justifies, it intellectualizes, it spiritualizes avoidance. It tells you that you're already doing enough, that growth doesn't have to be this uncomfortable, that other people aren't trying this hard, so why should you? And if that doesn't work, it attacks you emotionally. It makes you tired for no clear reason. It makes you restless when you try to be still. It makes discipline feel heavy and surrender feel risky. This is where many people turn back, not because they don't want truth, but because they don't understand the cost of carrying it. Truth dismantles illusions slowly, but relentlessly. You don't lose everything at once. You lose excuses first, then distractions, then identities that no longer align, and each loss feels like grief. The flesh experiences these losses as abandonment. It says, if you let go of this, who will you be? And the honest answer is, you don't know yet. And not knowing is unbearable to a part of you that survived by predicting outcomes. So the flesh clings to the past, even when the past no longer fits. It would rather be familiar and unfulfilled than uncertain and free. This is why awakening often feels lonely. You start walking away from internal patterns that others still live inside of. And even when people remain physically present, something shifts. You feel less mirrored, less validated, less understood. Not because you are superior, but because you are changing internally while your environment stays the same. The flesh hates this isolation. It craves belonging, even if belonging requires self-betrayal. And here is one of the most misunderstood aspects of this war. The flesh doesn't just resist awakening through temptation, it resists through exhaustion. You feel tired not because you're doing too much, but because you're holding opposing truths inside yourself. One part of you wants to rise, another part wants to rest in what it already knows. This inner contradiction drains energy. It's like pressing the gas and the brake at the same time. Over time, this creates fatigue that sleep cannot fix. And if you don't understand where that fatigue comes from, you may assume something is wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. Something is being renegotiated inside you. The flesh wants certainty before obedience. The spirit asks for obedience before certainty. And this reversal feels unsafe to a mind trained by control. The flesh says, show me the outcome and then I'll trust. Awakening says, trust, and the outcome will reveal itself. This is not poetic language. This is a real psychological and spiritual shift. And it terrifies the part of you that learned to protect itself by calculating every move. Surrender feels like freefall, and the flesh's deepest fear is falling without knowing what will catch you. So it keeps you busy. It fills your days with noise. It makes silence uncomfortable. It turns stillness into anxiety, because stillness is where the deeper voice becomes audible. And once you hear that voice, you can't unhear it. That voice doesn't shout, it doesn't rush, it doesn't negotiate, it waits. And waiting undermines the flesh's urgency. The flesh thrives on reaction. The spirit grows in response. As this war continues, you may notice a strange pattern. The more you try to fight the flesh directly, the stronger it feels. That's because resistance alone still keeps you identified with it. You are still engaging on its terms. The shift happens when you stop fighting and start witnessing. When you notice impulses without obeying them. When you feel emotions without letting them define you. When you allow discomfort without escaping it. This feels passive, but it is actually powerful, because the flesh loses authority the moment it is no longer obeyed automatically. This is slow work. There are no dramatic victories here. No instant freedom, just quiet moments where you choose awareness instead of impulse, truth instead of comfort, presence instead of escape. And over time, these moments accumulate. The flesh doesn't disappear, it weakens. It becomes less convincing, less urgent, less loud, not because you destroyed it, but because you outgrew its authority. You will still feel temptation, you will still feel fear, you will still feel the pull of old patterns. Awakening doesn't remove these things. It changes your relationship to them. They no longer define you. They inform you. They show you where you are still healing. And healing is not regression, it is integration. If you are still here, still listening, still wrestling, that means something in you has already chosen life over numbness. And that choice, even when it feels fragile, is irreversible. You may pause, you may stumble, you may even retreat temporarily. But once awareness enters the room, the door never fully closes again. The flesh resists because it knows this. It knows that its reign depends on unconsciousness. and you are no longer asleep. And once you are no longer asleep, the struggle changes its shape. It becomes quieter, more psychological, more internalized. The flesh stops trying to scare you away from awakening and starts trying to coexist with it. It adapts. It learns spiritual language. It borrows insight and turns it into identity. It says, "Look how aware you are now," and subtly replaces surrender with pride. This is one of its most refined strategies. The flesh does not mind growth as long as growth does not dethrone it. It is willing to improve habits, refine behavior, even adopt spiritual disciplines, as long as it remains the one in charge. This is why some people appear spiritually mature, but remain internally rigid. They know concepts, but they are not soft. They understand language, but they are not surrendered. They have insight, but not intimacy. The flesh loves knowledge without transformation. Knowledge gives a sense of control. Transformation removes it. Awakening at its deepest level is not about becoming impressive. It is about becoming empty enough to be filled by something truer than your fear. As this realization deepens, you may feel exposed. Old coping mechanisms no longer work, but new ways of being have not yet stabilized. This in-between space is uncomfortable. You are too awake to go back, but not yet grounded enough to feel at home. The flesh calls this instability. The spirit calls it transition, and transitions always feel like loss before they feel like gain. During this phase, emotions surface that you thought you had already dealt with. Old grief, old anger, old disappointments. Not because you failed to heal, but because healing happens in layers. The flesh hates layers because layers cannot be rushed. It wants resolution without process. It wants relief without surrender. But awakening insists on integration. Nothing is bypassed. Nothing is ignored. Everything is invited into awareness. This is where many people misinterpret the process and think they are regressing. They say, "I was doing better before." But better often meant more numb, more controlled, more defended. Awakening does not make you worse. It makes you honest. And honesty feels heavier than numbness at first. The flesh equates heaviness with danger. The spirit recognizes it as depth. You may also notice that your relationships begin to shift, not always externally, but internally. You become less reactive, less eager to explain yourself, less willing to betray your inner truth to maintain peace. This can create distance. Some people will feel uncomfortable around you without knowing why. Others will try to pull you back into old dynamics, not out of malice, but out of familiarity. Your awakening disrupts the unspoken agreements that once defined the relationship. And the flesh, which values belonging above truth, will tempt you to return to those agreements to avoid discomfort. This is where discernment becomes essential. Not every pull backward is temptation. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is love mixed with fear. Sometimes it is the realization that certain connections were built on versions of you that no longer exist. Letting go of those versions feels like betrayal, but staying loyal to them becomes self-abandonment. Awakening forces this choice again and again, not dramatically but quietly, in moments where no one is watching. The flesh hates these quiet choices. It prefers dramatic battles, because drama keeps things external. Quiet decisions dismantle it from within. When you choose not to react, when you choose not to numb, when you choose not to perform, when you choose not to explain yourself unnecessarily, each of these moments weakens the old structure, and weakening feels like threat. At some point, you may realize that the flesh is not your enemy. It is a frightened protector that no longer understands the environment you are in. It learned how to survive a world that required armor. Awakening brings you into a space where armor becomes weight, and weight slows movement. The flesh does not know how to live without armor, so it panics when you begin to lay it down. This is where compassion becomes power, not indulgence, not obedience, but understanding. You don't defeat the flesh by hating it. You outgrow it by no longer needing its strategies. You reassure it not with words, but with lived experience. Each time you move through discomfort and discover you are still held, something inside you relaxes. Each time you let go of control and are not destroyed, trust replaces fear. Slowly, the flesh learns that surrender is not annihilation. This process cannot be rushed, and trying to rush it is often another attempt by the flesh to regain control. Awakening unfolds at the speed of safety, not the safety of comfort, but the safety of truth. You are being reoriented from external certainty to internal alignment, from reaction to presence, from identity to essence. And essence is quiet. It does not argue, it does not defend, it does not rush, it simply is. As you spend more time in this state, the war does not end, but it loses its intensity. The flesh still speaks, but you no longer believe everything it says. You hear fear without obeying it. You feel desire without being ruled by it. You experience discomfort without escaping it. And this changes everything, because the flesh only has power where there is unconscious agreement. And you are no longer agreeing blindly. You are awake, and awakening once begun does not reverse. And when awakening no longer reverses, something subtle but irreversible happens inside you. The center of gravity shifts. You stop living from reflex and start living from awareness. This does not mean the flesh disappears. It means it is no longer the one making final decisions, and that loss of authority is what it fears most. The flesh can tolerate struggle. It cannot tolerate being seen clearly. Once you recognize its patterns, its urgency loses credibility, its threats lose weight, its promises lose shine. This is why awakening eventually brings a strange calm, even while the battle continues. Not a calm that comes from everything being resolved, but a calm that comes from clarity. You know what is happening now. You recognize the inner pull when it appears. You notice when comfort tries to replace truth. You see when fear disguises itself as logic, and seeing changes everything. The flesh depends on confusion. The spirit thrives on clarity. At this stage, the war becomes less about dramatic temptation and more about subtle alignment. The question is no longer, will I go back, but will I stay present? Presence is deeply threatening to the flesh because presence cannot be manipulated. You cannot rush it. You cannot bargain with it. You cannot numb it without knowing you are doing so. Presence exposes every attempt to escape reality. And reality, when fully faced, dissolves illusion. You may notice that your tolerance for superficiality decreases, not out of arrogance, but out of sensitivity. Small talk feels draining, noise feels heavy, performative interactions feel hollow. This is not because you are becoming antisocial or detached. It is because your nervous system is recalibrating. The flesh learned to survive by staying externally oriented, scanning, reacting, anticipating. Awakening draws attention inward, and inward attention reveals how much energy was being spent maintaining masks. This realization can be overwhelming. You may feel grief for the years you lived disconnected from yourself. You may feel anger for what you tolerated. You may feel sadness for how much of your life was shaped by fear rather than truth. The flesh tries to shut these emotions down quickly. It says, what's done is done. Move on. Don't dwell. But integration requires feeling, and feeling requires time. Awakening does not erase the past. It redeems it by allowing it to be fully acknowledged. There is also a moment when you realize that much of what you called your personality was actually adaptation. Humor used to deflect pain, strength used to avoid vulnerability, independence used to protect against disappointment. None of these were wrong. They were intelligent responses to your environment. But they are no longer the full story. Awakening invites you to live from essence, rather than rather than defense. And essence feels unfamiliar at first because it does not rely on performance. This is where the flesh becomes quieter but more persistent. It stops shouting and starts whispering. It suggests subtle compromises. It encourages you to keep one foot in the old world, just in case. It reminds you of how much you risk by fully surrendering. It warns you that if you let go too much, you might lose motivation, ambition, edge. But what it calls edge is often tension. What it calls ambition is often fear of insignificance. What it calls motivation is often avoidance of stillness. Stillness is where the deepest shift occurs, not the stillness of inactivity, but the stillness of non-resistance. In this stillness, you begin to act not from compulsion, but from alignment. You do things because they are true, not because they soothe anxiety. You move because something within you is clear, not because something within you is afraid. This is a profound reorientation, and it takes time for the system to trust it. As this trust grows, the flesh loses its urgency, its reactions slow, its narratives weaken. You still feel impulses, but they no longer hijack you. You still experience fear, but it no longer defines the path. You still encounter discomfort, but you no longer interpret it as danger. And this changes how you relate to life itself. Life stops feeling like something you must manage and starts feeling like something you can meet. This is the quiet victory of awakening, not dominance, not perfection, but freedom from unconscious control. You are no longer fighting yourself blindly. You are no longer punishing yourself for having impulses. You are no longer identifying with every thought, every urge, every emotional wave. You let them pass through awareness instead of building a home inside them. And one day, almost without noticing, you realize something important. The war that once consumed so much energy now takes up far less space, not because the flesh vanished, but because it no longer rules the inner landscape. It has been demoted from master to messenger. It alerts you to needs, wounds, and limits, but it no longer decides your direction. This is what spiritual awakening actually looks like. Not escape from humanity, but embodiment of truth within it. Not the absence of struggle, but the end of unconscious captivity. Not the destruction of the flesh, but its integration into something larger than fear. If you are here now, still listening, still feeling, still aware, then understand this. The resistance you feel is not proof that you are doing something wrong. It is proof that something old is loosening its grip. And what loosens often fights hardest, right before it lets go. You are not behind, you are not failing, you are not broken. You are in the middle of becoming conscious. And consciousness, once rooted, cannot be undone. Then let me finish this the only way it can be finished. Quietly, honestly, and directly with you. If you are still here, still listening, still feeling something stir inside you, that is not coincidence. People don't stay with words like these by accident. Something in you recognized itself along the way. Something in you felt seen, maybe for the first time in a long time. And that matters. There will be a moment, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, when you realize you are tired of fighting yourself. Not tired in a dramatic way, but in a deep, settled way. The kind of tiredness that no longer asks for escape, excuses, or distractions. The kind that quietly says, I don't want to live divided anymore. That moment is not defeat. It is maturity. Surrender does not mean giving up your will. It means releasing the illusion that control was ever keeping you safe. You are not being asked to disappear. You are being asked to stop armoring what no longer needs armor. The strength that carried you through your past did its job. You don't dishonor it by laying it down. You honor it by recognizing that you survived, and survival is no longer the goal. Awakening does not ask you to kill the flesh. It asks you to stop letting it lead. The flesh will still speak. Fear will still appear. Old impulses will still rise. but they will no longer decide who you are. They will no longer define your direction. They will simply be signals, reminders of where you've been, not commands about where you must go. You will learn to move without urgency, to choose without panic, to rest without guilt, to act without needing to prove anything. And this may feel unfamiliar at first because much of your life was driven by pressure rather than presence. But presence is not passive, it is precise, it is grounded, it is strong in a way that does not need noise. There may be people who no longer understand you. That's okay. You are not here to be easily categorized. You are here to be true. And truth often looks strange to those who are still negotiating with fear. You do not need to convince anyone of what is happening inside you. Your life will speak for itself in quieter ways. If at times you feel alone, remember this. Solitude is not abandonment when it is chosen by awareness. It is where integration happens. It is where the old self loosens its grip and the new self learns how to breathe. Nothing is wrong with you for needing space. Nothing is wrong with you for changing. You are not late. You are not broken. You are not losing your way. You are shedding what kept you alive so you can live. And one day, perhaps without ceremony, you will notice that the war inside you has softened into something else. Not silence, but alignment. Not certainty, but trust. Not perfection, but peace that does not depend on conditions. And when that happens, you won't need words like these anymore. You'll recognize the truth quietly, the way you recognize your own breath. Because the war was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to wake you up.